Matthew. That's our topic tonight. Matthew's gospel has oftentimes been called the church's preeminent gospel, and with a number of very good reasons for this. Part of that is that when the gospels have been grouped together, the church has always placed St. Matthew's gospel first. Now, of course, we open our own Bibles, we look to the start of the New Testament, and there it is. It's the first one, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. But even in the ancient church, when we look at when the Gospels were first beginning to be circulated in bound copies, with all four of them circulated together, in what were called codices, sort of an ancestor of the modern book. Even then, the orders varied, but there was this one exception. Matthew was always placed first, even in the ancient church. And there are more reasons than that why it's sometimes called the church's preeminent gospel. When you come to the Gospel of Matthew, it is an absolute storehouse of many of the most distinctive teachings about Jesus Christ, some of the most powerful scriptural treasures, if you will, that the church has concerning the life and teaching of Jesus Christ. The Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer, the Discourse on the Mount of Olives. With each of these, it is Matthew's version that we in the church know best, and even outside the church, which is known best in all of those things. And then there's also a number of the most well-known of Christ's sayings that are found only in Matthew's gospel. His words, "Come to me, all ye who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." His advice to be as wise as serpent, as innocent as doves. His admonition to Peter at his good confession, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." All of those are Matthew. That's where we find them. And so our task tonight is to get to know his gospel a little bit better. And it's a small thing to try to do this within the confines of a short, 40, 45-minute presentation. But that's our goal, so that when you open your Bibles and when you read Matthew for yourself, because hopefully that is the goal of what we're aiming at, is so that you will go and you will read the scriptures yourself with the church. But when you do that, you will have a clearer understanding of Matthew's background, of its structure, of the origin, where it came from, things like that, and particularly, what is it trying to communicate to us about the person of our Lord Jesus Christ. So, to start with, who was St. Matthew? Well, of course, he was one of the 12 apostles. We know that much. Beyond that fact, there is exceedingly little that the New Testament has to tell us about him. We do know from the gospel that bears his name that he was a tax collector. And we are given in chapter 9 of his gospel an account of what may have been his calling by Christ. If you wonder why I say what may have been, we'll get to that shortly. But as a tax collector, if you were here on Sunday, of course, it was the Sunday of the publican and the Pharisee. The publican is another name for the tax collector, and Father Kalanick did a wonderful job of talking at some length about what it was and what it meant to be a tax collector in first century Palestine. It was essentially a customs official working for the Roman government. They would set up shop in a booth somewhere in a region, and they would collect taxes and tariffs on goods as they passed to and fro within any given geographical area. They were particularly despised by the Jewish people for two primary reasons. Number one, they were seen as traitors. These are Jews who are working for Rome. They are working for the oppressor. Number two, they tended to enrich themselves by untoward means, as it were, by extortion, by skimming off the top. This didn't sit well with anybody. And so this is the vocation in which St. Matthew the Apostle is finding himself when Christ calls him to come and to follow me. Now, as a tax collector, Matthew, a couple things we can know just by that fact about St. Matthew. He would have been fluent and literate in both Greek and in Aramaic. Aramaic was the Hebrew dialect, as it were, the language that was spoken by Jews of the first century. Greek was the language of commerce, the official language of commercial transactions in the Roman Empire. So he would have had to have, as a tax collector, been proficient in both of those languages. Another interesting fact, a number of scholars have pointed out and have that there seems to be some evidence that tax collectors of that time period were proficient in a sort of shorthand. Now, we don't know this for certain, but if that's the case, it's an interesting thought to connect that with the fact that Matthew's gospel is the one that far and away records the most of the Lord's teachings and what he said in sermons and the like. Now, beyond that, there's really not much else that we can say about St. Matthew beyond the few bits of information that come to us through the church's tradition. We do know that through the church's tradition, that he preached in Jerusalem initially after the resurrection. At some point, he moved on from there into the region of Syria. Antioch, particularly, is where he was associated with as well. And then at some point after that, he moved into Africa, and he was martyred at some point in Ethiopia. Now, so that's St. Matthew. So now we come to the question, who wrote the gospel according to St. Matthew? We say, obviously, well, St. Matthew wrote it because it's got his name on it. But the gospel that bears his name never out and out identifies its author anywhere within it. And yet, at the same time, from at least the early 2nd century, the church has been unanimous in attributing this gospel to St. Matthew the Apostle. And in fact, this unanimous attribution is itself a fairly good reason to believe that it was indeed St. Matthew the Apostle who either wrote it, or if he did not write it, stood as the key figure or authority source behind it. Because he's hardly a prominent apostle. And if you have a gospel in the early church that's lacking an apostolic authority and you're wanting to cook one up to apply to it, he hardly seems the logical choice for the church to pick out and slap on this gospel. In his own gospel, the key apostolic figure is Peter. He goes out of his way in a number of areas in ways that the other gospels don't to present Peter as the key leader of the apostles. And so it doesn't seem like a very likely possibility that if there was no connection to Matthew the Apostle, the church would slap his name on this particular gospel. Now, there is a good argument that can be made that St. Matthew may not have been the actual author of the Greek text of the gospel according to St. Matthew, but that the author was a Jewish Christian living in 1st century Palestine, in a community where St. Matthew was either preeminent or had recently been preeminent before moving on. And in fact, that would explain a number of quirky little things about the gospel. Number one, it might explain the fact that the gospel according to St. Matthew doesn't particularly have, for lack of a better way of putting it, the feel of a first-hand eyewitness account. Father Canaanite talked last week about how it's actually the gospel according to St. John that by far and away feels most like that it's written by someone who was there firsthand. St. Matthew's gospel doesn't really have some of those little flourishes that St. John's gospel do. Also, it might make sense of another interesting difference between St. Matthew's gospel's account of the calling of St. Matthew and the same story in Mark and Luke. Now, the key difference is this, or actually it's the only difference. In the story of Matthew's calling in the gospel according to St. Matthew, the name of the tax collector who is called out of the booth is Matthew. When we go over to Mark and to Luke, the exact same story. The wording is nearly identical. It's clear that they're referring to the same incident. The name of the tax collector is Levi. Now, a lot of people, and there have been scholars and people through church history who have explained this by saying that, well, these are just two names for the same person. And they may well have been. It's not unknown for a first century Jewish individual to have two Semitic names. So whether his name was Matthew Levi or Levi Matthew, that's certainly a possibility. At the same time, there are other reasons why not a few scholars have questioned whether or not these two names would be linked together on one person. And if this was a gospel that was penned or authored by a particular Jewish Christian, and that it was done so under the sort of authority or oversight of the apostle St. Matthew, and this author wanted to include in his author an account of the calling of St. Matthew, but he didn't know the actual story of that account. It's certainly understandable that he might take this other account of a tax collector, knowing that St. Matthew is a tax collector, and appropriate this for his gospel as a sort of tip of the hat, as it were. Either way, one thing that we can know is that St. Matthew is the key figure behind the origin of this gospel. Now, when was the gospel written? Interestingly, the early church was strong in its contention that St. Matthew's gospel was the first gospel that was written. And yet, if you remember and you were here last week, one of the things that we're nearly certain of now is that St. Mark's gospel was the first gospel of all four that was written. Another interesting thing that is also widely said in the early church is that Matthew first wrote his gospel in Aramaic. And this is largely, we first see this in the writings of a guy named Papias. Papias was bishop of Hierapolis. He lived in the 1st and the 2nd century. And he wrote a work called The Exposition of the Sayings of the Lord in the very early 2nd century. We don't have the work anymore. It's lost. It's gone. So what we know of it comes from quotes of it in other sources. And for our purposes here tonight, the key source is the 4th century church historian Eusebius. And he quotes this particular passage from Papias, where he says, Matthew arranged in order the sayings in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted as best he was able. Now, when Papias says Hebrew language, what he almost certainly means is Aramaic, because that is what was spoken and written at this particular time in Palestine. And so, in other words, what Papias is saying is this, that Matthew the Apostle composed an ordered document that contained, in the Aramaic language, containing the sayings and teachings of Jesus Christ. Now, there are other church fathers who have said similar things. St. Irenaeus, who was writing in the late 2nd century, the late 100s, says something similar. And he actually says that St. Matthew composed a document in his gospel in the Hebrew language first, and that he did this in Jerusalem at the request of his church community when he was leaving, that they requested that he write down some things for them. Origen, writing in the 3rd century, says something similar, and then we come even to the late 4th century, turn of the 5th century. St. Jerome claims to have actually seen this early Hebrew version of Matthew's gospel, claims to have held it and to have read it. Now, here's the other thing, though. Whatever this document was, it's not the gospel according to Matthew as we have it. Because when we look at the gospel according to St. Matthew in our Bibles, it is exceptionally clear from the structure and the composition of it that it was an original document written originally in Greek. It's not a translation of something that went before. This is something that is patently obvious on a number of different levels. So whether this early work that some of the church fathers refer to was something that Matthew did in fact write, and then later reworked and set aside and then reworked entirely if he's the author of the gospel, or whether or not it was something that was used as a source that was consulted by the author if it was not St. Matthew of the gospel according to St. Matthew, or whether in fact Papias and some of the other church fathers are mistaken and are confusing another document with the one they attribute to St. Matthew. And as some scholars do argue, ultimately we can't know. But the document of Matthew's gospel, as we have it, is an original document that was composed in Greek. So that being said, what can we know about it? And about when it was written? Well, to start with, we know it was written after Mark's gospel. We also know that he had access to Mark's gospel. About 80% of Mark's verses appear in the gospel according to Matthew. And in most cases, Matthew has actually tightened them up a little bit, tightened their wording up. That's actually an indicator that Matthew is later. Because when you're using a source and editing from it, authors tighten the wording up. They don't tend to extrapolate and add more to it. Also, if Mark was written anywhere between 58, 59, and the early 60s, there's differing opinions on that. We know that Matthew was written after that. And from evidence within Matthew's gospel, I think that a very strong case can be mounted that it was written before AD 70. There's a lot of reasons I could give for that. I'm just going to give you two for the sake of simplicity, okay? The first one is this. Jesus predicts in his Olivet Discourse in 24:25 the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Now, if this had been written after AD 70, it seems rather preposterous to think that Matthew would not point out the fact that that had been fulfilled, because as we're going to see later, fulfillment is the central theme of Matthew's gospel. It is what he is concerned with from start to finish, the theme of fulfillment. So if this prophecy of Jesus, that the temple would be destroyed, had occurred, and this was being written after that prophecy had been fulfilled, it beggars the mind that Matthew would not point that out to us, as keen as he is to point out all the myriad other ways that fulfillment in the life and the teachings of Jesus is occurring. So that's one. A second one is the inclusion in his gospel of the story of the temple tax. It's the story where Peter is approached and said, do you and your master pay the temple tax? And Jesus sends Peter to find the fish and to open its mouth and to pull out the coin and pay the tax for you and me. You say, how does that tell you when it was written? Well, here's how it indicates that. Number one, after the temple was destroyed in AD 70, the temple tax didn't stop. Rome, as a way of rubbing the Jews' nose in their defeat, continued to demand the temple tax. Except now, Rome took it and they diverted it off to the temple of Jupiter in Rome. And this was something that was an incredible bane upon the souls of the Jewish people at that time. So if this is being written after AD 70, when the temple tax is this horrible offense to the Jewish people, it does not seem likely, it doesn't make sense, as it were, as to why Matthew would include this story, given the offense that it could cause, okay, in associating with that practice. So that's another reason. Given all of this, I think a date of composition somewhere in the mid to late 60s is very reasonable, and multiple scholars defend that as well, and certainly it's highly defensible. As to where it was written, it really comes down to one of two potential likelihoods. The early church's testimony was that it was written in Jerusalem or in the region of Palestine. More recently, there have been a number of very strong arguments that have come out of the academic community that it may have been written in Syria and potentially even in Antioch. I won't get into all of those. Strong cases can be made for each one of those positions. So, the components and structure of the gospel. That's what we want to talk about next. I've already noted that Matthew clearly had access to and used Mark's gospel. So what other sources did he have? And with that, we ask that question, we step very firmly into the realm of the academics, where certainty and dogmatism are very unfit companions for us. So I preface by saying that Matthew and Luke share about 230 verses in common. It's about 20%, actually, of Matthew's entire gospel. Now, for the most part, though not all of it, the material that they share in common are the sayings of Jesus, and not particularly focused on narrative, although there are a few exceptions to that. But on the surface, the easiest explanation would seem to be, well, Matthew used Luke, or Luke used Matthew. That's why they share these 230 some odd verses in common. Well, most scholars don't think, however, for a number of reasons, that Matthew or Luke had any access to each other, or that they knew about each other. And the reason they think that is because when it comes to the verses that they do share, they almost never put them in the same chronological order. Okay? Here's one example. In Jesus' lament over Jerusalem, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who stoned the prophets," etc., etc. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus says that after he's entered Jerusalem in the final week of his life. In Luke's gospel, Matthew and Luke are the only two who record that. In Luke's gospel, Luke has him saying it before he gets to Jerusalem, while he's on the way. So scholars have proposed, as a way of accounting for the, and this is something that happens in multiple other instances as well. So one of the things that scholars have proposed is a separate source, which both Matthew and Luke drew on. Father Kalanick talked about that briefly last week, with a source they call Q, from the German Quelle. I can't say it as with this as effectively as Father Kalanick did. But it's from the German word for source. Or at least that's what they say. There's some debate about whether that's even what it means. But anyhow, and this Q document would have hypothetically been a collection primarily of sayings of Jesus. And this is by far and away, among scholars of all persuasions, liberal, conservative, and all between, this is by far and away the dominant view. That accounts for the shared material of Matthew and Luke. Interestingly enough, there is an older theory. It's called the Vilki Hypothesis. And it has had something of a resurgence in recent years, and it actually does away with Q altogether. And it contends that Matthew actually used Luke, and it accounts for the different placement of the shared material with the claim that Matthew wasn't really interested in chronological accuracy with this material, that rather Matthew is grouping material together by topic and by theme. That's not an unpersuasive, especially when you look at the structure of Matthew's gospel, as we're going to touch on it here shortly. It's not an unpersuasive argument. There's about 30% of Matthew's gospel which is original to it and is not found anywhere else. It may have been based on his own knowledge. If this is written by another author, this may be connected with an earlier source, perhaps the Aramaic version, or perhaps something else entirely. There's no way to certainly know what the source of that 30% that's original with Matthew's gospel itself, as to what its ultimate origin is from. In terms of literary structure and outline, Matthew's gospel it's a wonder. The author was an incredibly skilled craftsman in terms of his literary structure and skills. It is very intricate. It is very elaborate in a number of different ways. For our purposes, without digging into the weeds, here's what you need to know, is that Matthew's gospel is built around 5 lengthy discourses or sermons by Jesus Christ. And in each one of these instances, we have a section of narrative, which is then followed by a very lengthy section of teaching, where Jesus gives a sermon or teaches on a common topic or theme. Here are the 5. The first one is the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5 through 7. The second one is Jesus' mission sermon that he gives before sending out the 12 in chapter 10. Chapter 13 is the third one. Jesus' teaching on the parables of the kingdom. The fourth one is his sermon on ethics and behavior in the church in chapter 18. And finally, the fifth one is his sermon on the Mount of Olives, oftentimes called the Olivet Discourse, where he teaches on the destruction of Jerusalem and on the last things, which occurs in chapters 24 and 25. A lot of scholars have pointed out it's an interesting thing that there's 5 of these lengthy teachings. There's 5 books of the Torah in the Jewish law, that maybe Matthew is patterning on this. Others have suggested as well that because these sections tend to group themes by topic, or by theme and by topic, that this was used as a sort of catechetical document to teach catechumens coming into the faith, the basics all brought together in a place that would have been easily accessible. Certainly, both very well may be true. These 5 sections of teaching are then bookended. On either side, you have the birth narratives and the stories concerning John the Baptist in chapters 1 through 4. And then on the other end of the gospel, we have the passion and resurrection narratives in chapters 26 through 28. Now, so that's the structure of the gospel. The purpose and themes of Matthew's gospel. That's what we want to focus on in the remaining time that I have. Matthew's gospel is far and away the most Jewish of all the gospels, maybe the most Jewish book in the New Testament itself. it quotes directly from the Old Testament more than the other three Gospels combined. He makes the most use of Aramaic words that he doesn't explain, seeming to expect that his readers know what they mean. He makes frequent references to certain Jewish customs or phrases without any explanation as to what he means. So, for instance, in Matthew 24, in the Olivet Discourse, as Jesus is talking about the coming destruction of the temple and the signs that would precede this, he says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. Well, any Jewish reader knows, okay, Daniel 11. They're going to know that this is referring to Daniel 11, the Antiochus Epiphanes. They wouldn't need that explained. But then you come to Luke's gospel. Luke's a Gentile who seems to be writing primarily for a Gentile audience, or at least that's the context in which he's writing. Luke changes that to when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. Matthew also traces Jesus' lineage back to Abraham, rather than, as Luke does, all the way back to Adam. Matthew goes back, and it's key to show his lineage back to the founder of the Jewish nation. And it also, another really interesting little quirk of Matthew's gospel that may be an indication of the Jewishness of it, is Matthew's liking for couplets of people that we don't see elsewhere. So, whereas in the other Gospels, we have the demoniac who is healed. In Matthew's Gospel, there's two of them there. And then in the other Gospels, we have one blind man coming to be healed by Jesus. In Matthew's Gospel, he has two blind men coming. In fact, he has two blind men coming twice. There is two different accounts. And then, most interestingly of all, in the other Gospels, Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, and Matthew has him on two beasts, basically. It's something you can miss if you're not looking for it, but in Matthew's gospel, Jesus tells them to go and to find a donkey and a colt. And now, how is this indicative of the Jewishness of the gospel? Well, it may be in the Old Testament, when establishing the validity of somebody's case, it says that it could be that the validity of their cause or of their words could be established by the testimony of two witnesses. And so that may be why Matthew is keen to kind of double up the witnesses in some of these stories as a way of emphasizing the truth of what he is saying about Jesus Christ. Anyhow, it seems to be written with an understanding of a Jewish audience as its, at least initially, prime audience. And I want to be careful to say that, at least initially. A lot of times scholars get really worked up into a tizzy about, well, this gospel was just written for this particular community here, or this one was just for this community here. And as Father Kalanick touched on last week, no. The gospels were written for all Christians. They were written for the whole church, okay? And certainly, Matthew understands that his gospel is for the whole church. He certainly understands that it was written, or rather, I should say, it was written with the assumption that it was going to be read publicly, and indeed that it would be read liturgically. In the Olivet Discourse, there's this little parenthetical aside that Matthew throws into it when he's actually talking about the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. And then there's this little stop in parentheses, and it says, let the reader understand. Okay, it's kind of his little voice, the author's voice entering into the text there. Jesus didn't stop in the middle and say, let the reader understand. That's the author. And he's not talking about when you're at home reading your Bible, understand. That word, let the reader understand, is referring to the person, the lector, reading the scriptures, or chanting them as they were at that time, publicly, and then expounding on them. So he certainly understands that his gospel would be read publicly. And it certainly, as we will see, was written with the whole church in view, because one of his key themes that we'll touch on is the universality of the good news of Jesus Christ. That the gospel is not just for the Jews, it's for all people. That's one of his key themes. So the Jewish focus, which he has, and his Jewish perspective bears especially heavily on what is his central theme, which I already mentioned, fulfillment. That's his central theme, fulfillment. It runs like a thunderous river through the entirety of his gospel. Jesus of Nazareth fulfills the entirety of the Old Testament. Matthew wants us to understand that. He is the fulfillment of all that has come before. There's a lot of different ways I could point to this. For the sake of simplicity and time this evening, I just want to show how he does this in chapters 1 and 2. Right out the gate, he launches his gospel with this emphasis that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. Even in verse 1, the gospel begins, the genealogy of Jesus Christ. The use of that word, Christ, in his first sentence of the whole gospel, it's the Greek word Christos, which is itself the translation of the Hebrew word Mashiach or Messiah, anointed one. He wants his readers to understand straight out the gate that this Jesus of whom he is writing is the Messiah. He is the one promised in the Old Testament. He then moves from there into the genealogy, and the whole way he has structured the genealogy, starting with the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, moving up through David, the line of the Judaic kings. And it's all crafted into these 3 groups of 14. Matthew wants to convey this notion to us that all of history is an ordered whole, a unified whole that has culminated in the person of Jesus Christ, who then, after concluding, he tells us 2 more times. Once in verse 16, and then in verse 17, at the end of the genealogy, 2 more times he calls him Jesus Christ. He's driving that point home, that this one of whom I am writing is the fulfillment of what has been looked for and what has been promised in the Old Testament. And then from there, in the rest of chapter 1, on to the end of chapter 2, Matthew tells 5 stories, short little narratives. And in each case, at the end of telling that short little story, he concludes by following it up with an Old Testament reference, which he says is then fulfilled in that specific aspect of Jesus' life or in the events surrounding Jesus' birth. So, for instance, in verses 18 through 23, we have the account of the virginal conception of Jesus, the virginal conception of Jesus and the appearance to Joseph by the angel. And then it concludes, and all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel, for he shall save his people from their sins, etc., etc. That's the pattern he follows 4 more times in those first 2 chapters. And that phrase, this took place to fulfill, thus was fulfilled, then was fulfilled, it is a refrain that Matthew launches into over and over and over and over again throughout the entirety of his Gospels. And here's the interesting thing. In chapters 1 and 2, he's emphasizing this theme of fulfillment in more ways than just this. He's not just quoting the Old Testament and saying, this was fulfilled. He's not just giving the genealogy. He's also far more subtle than that in the ways that he's pointing and directing our attention to Jesus as the fulfillment. The events that he narrates themselves in these opening 2 chapters themselves echo Old Testament stories. So we have the birth of a boy who is the promised deliverer, who is endangered and must be protected from the wrath of a king who is seeking to destroy all the boys in that region. What does that remind you of? Moses. Exactly. Moses. And this is a key theme with Matthew. Jesus is the new Moses. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law which came through Moses. And so we have, for instance, in Matthew 5 through 7, when Jesus is giving his masterful sermon on all the ethical teaching of the kingdom and the ethics of life within the kingdom, we have him saying, you have heard it said, and then he quotes from the law of Moses. And then he says, but I then say unto you, and he often delivers something that's even more stringent than what Moses' law was. And we call this the Sermon on the Mount. It says at the introduction to this whole sermon, and then Jesus went up on the mountain, and he opened his mouth and taught them. Where did Moses receive the law? On the mountain. on Mount Sinai. It's not an accident that Matthew's presented it this way. He wants us to see that. Also, there's others. There's the account that we have in the early 2 chapters of the wise men bringing gifts to the king, who is the son of David. And it echoes another story in the Old Testament, the Queen of Sheba, who comes and brings gifts to Solomon, the king, who is the son of David. And in fact, Jesus will himself in chapter 12 reference that story. And he says, something greater than Solomon is here, referring to himself. So all of these things, these are all threads that Matthew is drawing in, and he is weaving all these threads together just here in the first 2 chapters at the outset of his gospel to convey that all that has come before, all of God's law, all of God's promises to Israel, all of the history of Israel itself, all of it has culminated and has been leading inexorably here to this place, to the coming of Jesus of Nazareth. He's the fulfillment of it all. 2 other themes that I want to mention briefly before we close. The first is the theme of the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven. It's a unique phrase, actually. It only occurs in Matthew's gospel. In the other gospels, they use the phrase kingdom of God. And the interesting thing is that most scholars think that Matthew has probably retained the actual phrase that Jesus used. Here's why. The Jews of that period generally refrained from using the divine name Yahweh. That's very well known. They often were reticent about even using generic reference to God. And so it was very common in everyday speech or in common speech when speaking about God to use kind of circumlocutions like heaven bless you or the will of heaven or the heavenly glory, things like that. And so that is why a lot of scholars think that it's likely that Jesus' use of the phrase kingdom of heaven has been preserved in Matthew's gospel. But anyhow, what is the kingdom of heaven? Since I'm saying it's a theme in Matthew's gospel, that's a very complex question. You could have a whole string of adult education series just on what is the kingdom of heaven, what does it mean? It's something that is eternally, that exists eternally. And yet at the same time, it is something that Christ says he is bringing into the world at his coming. St. John the Forerunner says, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It's arriving. And at the same time, the scripture tells us that the kingdom of heaven is something that will be yet brought in fullness in Christ's second coming and in the eschaton. So the kingdom of heaven is both something that is, it is something that has been brought with the coming of Christ and that yet will be brought with the future coming of Christ. So it's a complex enough subject. But anyways, for our purposes, simple definition could be this, that the kingdom of heaven is life in unity with the Holy Trinity. It is life in unity with the Holy Trinity. And this is what Christ brings. In our fall, and in our sin, we have turned away from that life for which we were created. And here's an interesting thing. Matthew's gospel is divided into 28 chapters. Now, these chapters came along centuries after the scriptures were written. These were not part of the original documents. But the center of Matthew's gospel is not chapter 14. The center of his gospel, geographically, as it were, if you take the amount of writing and find the exact center, where there's even amounts on either side, the exact center is chapter 13. And I mentioned chapter 13 earlier. Chapter 13 is the section where Jesus teaches on the parables on life in the kingdom and what the kingdom is. It's not by accident that Matthew has put that at the exact center of his gospel. Jesus of Nazareth, the one promised in the Old Testament, has come to show us the way to the kingdom. He has come to bring us back into the fullness of the divine life in the Holy Trinity for which we were created. That's at the center of his entire gospel. That's the exact center of it. It's not by accident. The other thing that I would emphasize as a key theme, that the kingdom is extended to all people. Now, I mentioned earlier that Matthew's gospel is the most Jewish of gospels, yet it has this really interesting paradox about it, in that it's the most Jewish of gospels, and yet at the same time, it also has the most antagonistic and polemic language and attitude towards the Jewish leaders of the first century. We think about all the nasty invectives about the Pharisees. Most of them come from Matthew's gospel. I mean, the Pharisees really come in for it in his gospel. He references them endlessly as hypocrites. They are serpents. They are a brood of vipers. They are blind guides. They are sons of Gehenna, which means hell. These all come from Matthew's gospel. They are drugged through the verbal ringer, as it were, in his gospel, more so than they are anywhere else. And the root of this, as many scholars have noted, is likely the enormously strong opposition to the early Christian community, which especially got ramped up in the 60s and 70s in the Pharisaic community. And so, as it were, Matthew is leveling his rhetorical guns on the contemporary key opponents of the church. He's letting people know these are blind guides, and they are leading their people astray. And for instance, he has a section in chapter 8 where he speaks specifically about how many will come from the east and the west, and they will sit at the banquet of the kingdom with Abraham, whereas the sons of the kingdom, by which he means those of Israel who failed to fulfill their purpose, who failed to recognize their Messiah and to embrace him, that they will be cast into outer darkness. And this dovetails into his theme of the universality of the kingdom that Jesus brings. It is a kingdom for all people, for everyone from the east and from the west. It's not just for Jews. It is a kingdom for the Gentiles, not just to the people through whom it was first revealed and promised. There's a number of ways that he does this in other aspects throughout the gospel. For example, in chapter 8, where he has the account of the healing of the centurion's servant. And then also in chapter 15, he has the account of the healing of the Canaanite woman's daughter. These are accounts which we find elsewhere in the other Gospels, but Matthew's account is a little bit different in that it's structured to really make the focus of the story the fact of the faith of these non-Jewish people and Christ's recognition of it and response to it. And in fact, later on in chapter 15, Matthew follows up with a second account of the feeding of the multitudes, except with this difference. Whereas his first account, Jesus feeds his Jewish audience. In the account of chapter 15, it appears to be a Gentile audience that he performs this miracle for. And of course, all of it culminates in another one of those unique aspects of Matthew's gospel, chapter 28, and the Great Commission, which we have in his gospel. And this commission where Christ commissions his people to go out and make disciples of all nations. All nations. He is keenly interested in communicating this fact that this kingdom which Jesus brings, of bringing us back into the life of the Holy Trinity and into union with the Trinity, this is for all people. I'll stop there and wrap it there. So hopefully that you have a little bit of at least a better understanding of the background surrounding St. Matthew's Gospel that will be of use and will be helpful to you when, again, as we would hope, you would open the Scriptures and read them yourselves.